Hi everyone. This is kind of a video response to a video that I saw. It was made by someone on YouTube who calls himself Elvis is the Man, and that's all together as one word. If you want to look him up and check out his channel, little promotion here. He's obviously a real Elvis fan. Seems kind of young, nothing wrong with that. I personally think Elvis could use all the young fans he can get these days because even though I like both Elvis and the Beatles, and I'm wearing a shirt today to show it about liking Elvis, I think that the Beatles music to me kind of interests new generations a lot more than Elvis's does. You know, that's the only thing. I love Elvis throughout his career, the 50s, the 60s, and yes, I even love some Elvis movie songs, believe it or not, and in the 70s. The thing about Elvis, though, is his music kind of dates more than the Beatles does, I think, in my opinion. And as a result, I'm not really sure that young people in the 21st century will gravitate to him as much as they do Beatles. They still find the Beatles inventive, creative, kind of unusual, exciting, enticing. Anyway, that's just my opinion there. But anyway, I want to thank Rock and Roll 73 for alerting me to the video that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to try to provide a link below to the person's video so you can check it out for yourself. Basically, he calls his video The Beatles Mocking Elvis. Okay? And he's of the opinion that all the Beatles seem to do whenever he watches them on TV or any interviews with them is that the Beatles are always degrading and saying derogatory things about Elvis Presley. Now, that's true that they've done that. But let me tell you, for somebody that's been around longer and somebody who has a collection back there of hundreds of interviews, TV appearances, ranging from, say, 1962 all the way up to probably last week, 2019, I can tell you that there are a lot of times where they're very complimentary to Elvis. So that's a lot of nonsense, plain and simple. They do not just degrade Elvis. Let's get that straight right from the beginning. Sure, there are times when they have. Now, the person in the video, Elvis is the Man, when he talks about Paul McCartney, he mentions how very frequently Paul does in fact say, you know, Elvis did a version of Yesterday and he changes the lyrics around. You know, Paul wrote the song as admitting that he did something wrong, you know, in the lyrics. He said, I, let me see, how you don't know the song? How many times have I listened to Yesterday? I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday. Well, when Paul observes Elvis, he says that Elvis supposedly sings, I must have done something wrong. Like he doesn't know what, you know, why'd she leave? I don't know what I did wrong. I must have done something wrong. He doesn't own up to it. And I think that's an astute observation, and it is Paul McCartney's song. And Paul McCartney has the right to say it should have been done the way that I intended it to be done. You know, it's kind of admitting that he made a mistake in Paul's original song. But in all fairness to Elvis is the Man, when watching his video, I noticed he correctly pointed out that Presley only really does that, I think, in a rehearsal footage. I don't know if it's from That's the Way It Is, maybe. I don't know if it's outtakes or if it's actually from the movie, but it looks like a studio session. Elvis says, I must have done something wrong, you know, there in that particular version. Perhaps not on the actual recording of it. But anyway, but here's the thing. Plenty of times I've seen interviews with Paul where he talks about Elvis and says about, you know, how amazing Elvis looked, for one thing. He always says, he looked great. I mean, that's the first thing, you know. I mean, wow, we'd see him and we'd say, who's that? You know, it's so great looking, you know, and everything like that. And he said, you know, Elvis was the guru, the king, you know, to them when they were first growing up. And he goes on to say, you know, also I think, and I have interviews where he goes on about Elvis's voice. I think a hell of a voice on Elvis. I remember Paul saying. Now I can't pinpoint. There's so many interviews from countries all around the world that and different eras that I can't really remember which comes from which right now. But he's very, very, very complimentary towards Elvis. Paul is. I remember one time he said he didn't care for things like the saxophone solo in the song Hard Headed Woman, which I disagree with Paul. I like the saxophone. I like horns in my music, so I'm partial to to the horns in the music. But I really remember him saying that, yeah, okay, he didn't care for the saxophone. Well, let's get past that. Elvis is the Man also says that they never give him Elvis any credit for the '68 comeback. Well, that's just not accurate either. But he wouldn't know. He wouldn't hear every single interview ever done by the solo Beatles. But I remember Ringo saying, in one particular interview, I wish I knew what it was, but he goes, talking about how Elvis went on to do movies and, that kind of thing. But then he goes, but he came back. He came back, with the comeback. And he acknowledged how great the comeback was. I want to talk about George Harrison next. Elvis is the Man has a really good point about George. And I think George, to be fair and weigh this both ways, I think George was a little hypocritical in this, and I'll explain it. In the anthology, Beatles anthology, there's a moment where you have Paul, George, and Ringo gathering around a table, and they're talking about all kinds of subjects, and they bring up Elvis Presley, and George bemoans the fact that he got to see Elvis, I think it was in 74, something like that, maybe. And he said, he came on stage with this big belt and that suit and everything. And he said, man, Elvis, he says, I just wanted him to get into his blue jeans, man. Get your blue jeans on and sing That's All Right, Mama. And here's the hypocrisy in that, to be fair. George Harrison was very irate at the fans back when he did his own tour in 1974, the Dark Horse Tour. And during that tour, George Harrison did all sorts of things, like, for example, he changed the words to In My Life, John Lennon's song, and he said, in my life, I love God more. And he did things like playing a lot of Indian music. He's very much into Ravi Shankar, and he played Indian sets during his concerts, and people didn't want to hear it, and stuff like that. And at one point, I believe, George jumped up and said, I'd die for Indian music, but not for this. And he held up his rock and roll guitar. I think, something like that. He also changed the lyrics to While My Guitar Gently Weeps to While My Guitar Gently Smiles, I think. And a lot of fans rejected this, and George didn't like that, You know the story. I mean, people like to progress, they like to advance, and people just want the same old Beatles songs all over again. And a lot of artists don't like when people hanker back to their old days. And here's George condemning Elvis for basically going into, Vegas and doing a Vegas show and all this stuff. Now I want to talk a little bit about something else that Elvis is the Man said. He said that why were the Beatles putting Elvis down for progressing and evolving? Because after all, the Beatles progressed and evolved. They went to Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and gradually went up and tried different things, psychedelia. They got more deep in their music. Well, here's, in my opinion, and in the Beatles' opinion, what I think the difference is. What the difference is. The difference is that they didn't think of Elvis's path as he was going as evolving. They thought he was devolving. That's the difference. The Beatles did indeed go up. Everything the Beatles did, album by album by album, was climbing and trying new heights, reaching new levels. Elvis, in the Beatles' minds, and in a lot of people's minds, went down. And of course, we know when he started doing the 1960s mainly and started getting into the more silly movies, he was kind of had to do, contracted to do those movies and to make those terrible songs and things, some of which I like. I said at the beginning, I like some of the songs. But the fact is, they were kind of going down for Elvis. Elvis made those silly movies, made the silly songs. That's not evolving, that's devolving. And also, a lot of people think that once you put on your Vegas jumpsuit and go out there and start singing, and, doing, like Wayne Newton is now capitalized on, you're doing this cabaret shtick, all of a sudden, a lot of people think that's not really progressive, that's going down. It depends how you want to look at it. Certainly, for people who grew up with rock and roll, and the Beatles did, they loved Elvis. Elvis was their rock and roll king. To see him all of a sudden go down and do that kind of like lounge singer kind of stuff, to them, you can understand why they thought that wasn't progressive, that was regressive or going down. Okay, so let's be fair about that. I also want to say John Lennon. I haven't brought John Lennon up. Elvis is the Man talks about John Lennon. It's true that one of John's last interviews, he said, the quote was, When Elvis died, people were harassing me in Tokyo for a comment. Well, I'll give it to you now. He died when he went in the army. That's when they killed him. That's when they castrated him. So the rest of it was just a kind of living death. Now, John could be brutally honest like that, but at other times you have to realize he really loved Elvis, and I'll give you some other examples of it. In 1972, John did the one-to-one benefit concert at Madison Square Garden, and as a tribute to Elvis, he did the song Hound Dog. And at the end of Hound Dog, John just gets carried away and says, "Elvis, I love you." He screams up in 1972. So you have that. Then we'll go to 1975. In 1975, John also joined Andy Williams and also joined Paul Simon on stage at the Grammys. And at the Grammy Awards, John is sporting a huge pin that says Elvis on it, in script letters. So in 1975, he's honoring Elvis as well. Now, this is important to me. The last day that John was alive, the day that John was murdered, he did an interview for RKO Radio. And in that RKO Radio interview, I believe it's that interview, or somewhere in 1980, and this is after Elvis is dead, and this is after, Elvis has been gone a few years. He says, he's talking about how much he loves early rock and roll music, and he goes, today, I heard "I Want You, I Need You, I Love You" on the radio today, and I was in heaven. He says, so he's the last day that he was breathing, he gave Elvis a tribute by saying how much he loved "I Want You, I Need You, I Love You" still. But anyway, it's not surprising that the Beatles found out that their hero had suddenly turned the corner and went to the dark side. It's not really hard to understand that, is it? The last thing I want to say here, I want to save the best point for last. I think it's hilarious in a way that Elvis is the man, made this video complaining about how the Beatles are mocking Elvis when he forgets and neglects to mention completely, how about Elvis Presley, what he did when he disowned the Beatles and said that they were bad for youth and bad for culture. And he went to President Nixon and said, these Beatles are not good for the youth and everything. All of a sudden he turned on the Beatles and became a Benedict Arnold towards the Beatles. And that hurt the Beatles. There's plenty of times I've seen interviews with them saying they were hurt by that. Ringo in particular. Very, very sad to Ringo that Elvis did that. Thought they were bad. Beatles were a bad influence. Okay, so I think that last comment says it all. So the Beatles got a little annoyed with that. Beatles weren't happy that Elvis went back on them like that. You could see them being perturbed about it. So who's really doing the worst thing? The ex-Beatles or Elvis? Anyway, interesting video that Elvis is the Man made, and check that out and let me know your comments here. And of course, this is turning into a Elvis versus the Beatles. I like Elvis. I love the Beatles. There's a saying that, it's in a scene from Pulp Fiction, the Quentin Tarantino movie, but it was cut out. It was extra footage where it's been said that you can like both Elvis and the Beatles, but you can't like them both equally. I'll always prefer the Beatles. I think, they obviously were, more inventive, more creative. I think they stand the test of time better than Elvis will, but I'm still a fan. Thanks, everybody.